we arrive at the last two classes. As I said earlier, I'm leaving for the very end, for the grand finale, which is today. The largest and the smallest entities in our diagram. Just to repeat the diagram again, remember we begin at the very bottom of it all with people, persons. Then we have communities and organizations and assemblages that are made out of those communities and organizations. Then on the other side we had the geographical or spatial locales within which those assemblages carry on their daily practices, which are in fact part of the assemblage. In other words, an organization is not just the authority structure and the people arranged in a hierarchy, it's the chairs and furniture and computing machines and walls and so on that makes the entire assemblage work. We separated them out for the sake of simplicity, but they are also part of the assemblage. And the largest locale was what we call territorial states, referring to kingdoms, empires, and later on nation states. But again, even though we're talking about the geographical area with the cities organizing that space, with communities and organizations inhabiting that cities and making the cities work on a day-to-day basis, and with the people that staff those organizations, that are members of those communities, and that are ultimately the working parts of all of those entities, the parts that actually get things done day to day. The reason we cannot reduce everything to those people is because, as I said, each one of the entities has its own properties that cannot be reduced to the component parts, even if those component parts are the ones that actually carry on the day-to-day interactions. Because, as I said, as long as a different set of people was carrying out those day-to-day practices, and the emergent properties remain the same, the solidarity of communities, the legitimacy of organizations, and so on, then even though we do need those people at the bottom, we don't need this specific group of people, and therefore not this specific group of properties. That was our criterion from the beginning as to what counts as an emergent property. So, the smallest size is people, the largest size is territorial states. Those are typically what are included in social science, both microeconomics and microsociology, macroeconomics and macrosociology, and are what we normally refer to as the individual and society. And as I've been saying to you from the beginning of the class, guys, posing social problems in terms of the individual versus society is extremely misleading. It leads to fantasy narratives that have very little to do with reality. And most of the action, in most of the historical explanations, occurs somewhere in the middle, including communities, combinations of communities and organizations, or organizations coming together into networks, or communities coming together into coalitions and alliances. So I've spent 8 classes out of 10 on those intermediate levels, so as to stress to you the importance of those intermediate levels, the importance of never talking about the individual versus society. You know, in little narratives like Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, or you know, where the individual is an architect, of course. What else could the individual be? And society is all those forces that are not allowing the architect get his job done, interrupt his creativity or constrain his creativity and so on. Now, of course, you probably were clapping when you were watching that movie. Yeah, you know, rooting for the architect, and that's fine. But in reality, we have a completely different type of thing. And you never really think of the architect, you always think of architects as a population. It's a small population of professionals linked together in professional networks, perhaps belonging to organizations, grouped together into teams within studios. It's an entirely different reality than the individual versus society. Since that was the wrong idea I was trying to steer you away from, I purposefully left the smallest and the largest entities for the very end, so that we would spend most of the class talking about the intermediate entities, showing you how important they are as part of historical explanations. But eventually, we have to get to individual persons and individual nation states, individual kingdoms, individual empires. Because despite the fact that they have hogged all the attention and therefore deserve to be downplayed, we cannot ignore them. At the end of things, you have to confront the largest entities and the smallest entities. Right? Once you guys realize that all the intermediate entities are important too. So that's the grand finale for our class today. We're going to start with the largest entities, nation states, kingdoms, empires, and we're going to end with the smallest entities. The largest entities still relate to our diagrams. When we come back at 2 o'clock, I'm not even going to draw this diagram anymore, because we're going to be talking about not only persons, but we're going to be going even inside the brains of persons. We're going to be talking about sub-personal components. Because what we need to do, of course, is to show that persons, that is your subject, your ego, your self, your psychological self, whatever you want to call it, is also emergent. It's not something that's there and can be taken for granted. It's something that emerges, just like everything else, from the interactions between its component parts. And the component parts of the self, of the ego, are sub-personal components. Beliefs, desires, sensory perceptions, internal feelings like pride and humiliation, or love and hatred. And same thing, of course, as external intensities of color, intensities of sound, intensities of aroma, and so on. All those sub-personal components need to be given coherence, and from that coherence, a subject, a self emerges. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, or rather at 2 o'clock. Right now, we're going to concentrate on the largest of all the scales, the scale of the territorial state. I'm dividing our little diagram that I've been drawing over and over and over again into roughly 2 halves. Prior to 1500, or more exactly, prior to 1494, city-states dominate Europe, particularly militarily. City-states, the Italian city-states in particular, invented around the year 1300 the commercialization of violence. What does that mean? Well, invented or reinvented, because it had already existed before, the profession of the mercenary. That is, the soldier that doesn't have any loyalty to any particular army because it's the army of the city or because it's the army of the state. I work for anyone who pays me. So commercial, mercenaries had existed in the past, but the systematization of that commercialization of violence was performed in Italian city-states around 1300, or in the years between 1200 and 1300. Not only the career of mercenary became stabilized, so that you as a little kid could, think of, what do I want to do when I grow up? Your grandma comes in and asks you, so what do you want to do, little Johnny? What do you want to do when you grow up? And you could very confidently say to your grandmother, I want to be a merc, Grandma. You want to be a mercenary, because being a mercenary was a career that was stabilized enough that you could actually bank on becoming a mercenary when you were a grown-up. Not necessarily the most glamorous of careers, not necessarily the one that would give your grandma a fuzzy feeling. Oh, he wants to be a doctor. Oh, he wants to be a fireman. He wants to be a merc. And in addition to the mercenary, we have the condottiere, the manager of mercenaries, a person who you could hire as a king, or as a prince, or as some kind of wealthy merchant belonging to a city-state. You could hire to put together an army for you. The condottiere is a specialized profession, and it again, as a profession, as a stable profession that you could count on its existence, dates from around the 1300s in Italy. So the city-states had the advantage. They had commercialized violence. They were experts at putting together armies of mercenaries. They were richer, and therefore they had more money to put those armies together. And therefore, prior to 1500, they could defend themselves against any larger entity at any time. From 1500 on, as we will see in more detail on, city-states, the remaining city-states, either begin to fade out or begin to be absorbed into larger entities. Cities now stop being relatively independent, particularly regional capitals, stop having the kind of control they have over their regions, and now begin to be controlled by another city, which has now become the national capital, or the capital of the kingdom, the capital of the empire. And now you have to take orders coming from the capital. So they lose their autonomy, they lose their independence, they are absorbed into larger entities, and that is, of course, the condition in which we find them in our own time. So, roughly divided into two halves, we're going to be talking about this transition in a second. The transition, as usual, is not sharp. It's not as if the moment the year 1500 hit, boom, boom, pow, all of a sudden there was a change. It really is a period of time, a period between 1494 and 1638. 1494 is the first successful invasion of city-states, Italian city-states, by armies from a territorial state, France. Prior to that, armies from territorial states did not dare to invade city-states, and least of all, Italian city-states, which basically meant sending an army across the Alps and doing a kind of trans-Alpine invasion. That by itself was daring, but then you have to be sure that you're going to get to the other side and win. We're going to find out in a second just what happened there. 1638 is the period that marks the end of city-states as important historical actors. It's the end of a very long war, called the 30 Years' War, which lasted literally 30 years, from 1618 to 1638. And all the contenders, it was a religious war. It was Catholics versus Protestants. It was the last thoroughly religious war ever fought in Europe. Yes, you can say the acts of terrorism, Islamic terrorism, say, are acts of religious war. But what I'm talking here about is a massive war. The 30 Years' War was not a world war, because Japan and the United States and other countries like in World War I were not involved, but it was the first truly continental war. In terms of dead people as a percentage of existing population, it is as lethal as World War I. So in the memories of people, this remained always a massacre of hundreds of thousands of people. And all the participants were so exhausted, you can imagine, after 30 years of warfare, that in 1648, 1618, 30 years. Sorry about that, guys. Your notes are going to look very bad now, because we're going to have to. 1648, end of the 30 Years' War, which started in 1618, is the simple sum. Should fix that mistake. They are so exhausted after 30 years of war that they come together to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Westphalia, which is the first document in European history of international law. How do we know it's international law? Because the document mentions territorial states, kingdoms, empires, as legal actors, as legal agents, just like, say, corporations today are mentioned in the law as legal agents. So you can sue either the corporation or you can sue a person in the corporation. You have two choices, because there are at least two legal agents in the law. The first time in European law, territorial states become legal agents mentioned in a legal document is the Treaty of Westphalia. And also, the concept of sovereignty is born. Now, the concept had actually been born in 1597 as a philosophical concept, something that a jurist, not a lawyer, but an expert on law, coined. But as is usual with concepts in law, the moment that is first applied in a document that's binding, and in a document that retrospectively has plenty of historical weight, is in the Treaty of Westphalia. And sovereignty basically means that a country can do whatever it wants within its borders, and other countries cannot say anything about it. Including, for instance, mistreating minorities that would normally belong, at least say linguistically, to another country. So the Treaty of Westphalia made it legal for, say, French authorities to mistreat German-speaking minorities within its territory, with Germany not being able to say anything about it. Or for Italian city-states to mistreat French-speaking minorities, with France not being able to say anything about it. Now, sovereignty has today been restricted. It has been restricted by international organizations, such as the UN. The invasion of the no-fly zone over Libya right now is an infringement on Libya's sovereignty. It goes against what the Treaty of Westphalia said. Nobody can do anything to the Libyan government just because it massacres its own minorities. That is full sovereignty. But with the birth of international organizations like the UN, international law became different. And now, if you can pass a resolution of the UN saying that in this particular conditions, the sovereignty of a country plays now second place to the individual human rights of its inhabitants, then you can authorize the use of force. You can authorize the infringement of that sovereignty, which is what the no-fly zone is right now. It is legal because it was supposed to say the invasion of Iraq, which was illegal by international law. The no-fly zone over Libya right now is legal. There is a document by the correct organization authorizing that, and there was a vote and so on, but it's a breach of sovereignty. So sovereignty has now been curtailed since World War II, since the birth of the United Nations. The ancestor of the United Nations, the League of Nations, did not have enough power to authorize this kinds of breach of sovereignty. So the idea that sovereignty can be constrained is a relatively recent one. It's of the last 50 years. Between the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of World War II, nations did not have a right to intervene in whatever other nations did. That's what sovereignty was supposed to be. So these are our two dates that are important for us. Before 1494, cities reigned supreme, militarily, economically, culturally, and so on. After 1648, cities continued to play a role, but now as parts of a larger assemblage. Now as integrated within kingdoms, as the capital of the kingdom, as regional capitals that have to obey the capital, and so on. Now part of a hierarchy of cities with the national capital or the capital of the kingdom as its at the top of the hierarchy. In terms of space, I also need to point something out. The polka dot regions here, you see the polka dots, are what we have called urbanized areas. Is where the areas where this upswing mostly had its effect. The majority of cities born during that upswing are born in the polka dot areas. Flanders, today's Belgium, the United Provinces, today's Holland, the northern part of Germany, which were a bunch of city-states, independent city-states, nevertheless forming an alliance called the Hanseatic League, northern Italy and parts of central Italy. Those areas were in most respects non-feudal, meaning they were not subject to an agricultural economy that was relatively closed, in which the land is owned by a bishop, by a prince, by a baron, by some other aristocrat, and there is an exchange of protection, military protection for peasants in exchange for forced labor. That kind of protection, as everybody knows from watching gangster movies, is called a protection racket. It's like when gangsters walk into your mom and pop store and tell the owner, hey, we're here to sell you protection. You have to pay $300 a month and you have protection. Protection against who? Protection against us. We'll beat the crap out of you. You don't pay the $300. So that kind of protection is the protection that feudal lords offered in all these areas here. The area that would eventually become Spain, the area that would eventually become France, the area that would eventually become other countries over here like Austria, England. They were all feudal in that sense. Now even in the polka dot areas, so the cross-hatch areas are feudal, and the polka dot areas are urbanized. Even in the urbanized areas though, the land was owned by feudal lords. The land was owned by bishops, by princes, by barons, and so on. But there was a difference. The areas in the urbanized areas managed to exchange a relationship of domination by the feudal lord by a contractual relationship of rent. They rented the land from those feudal lords. I've already mentioned this in another class. And that changes everything. It's a relationship, but now it's not a direct relationship of domination mediated by weapons and mediated by force. That is by a protection racket. It's a relationship of rentiers or tenants to the landlord, which is a very different domination than one in a protection racket. You were renting the land from the feudal lord. You were paying rent collectively. The city collected taxes and then collectively paid for that rent. And in exchange, they got autonomy. Autonomy from feudal rules and regulations. They were what is sometimes called temporary autonomous zones. They had bought their autonomy at the expense of exchanging one type of relationship, a protection racket, for another type of relationship, the relationship landlord-tenant, and obtained the right that within their walls they could set their own laws, they could set their own regulations, they could enforce their own laws, and citizens of a particular city-state did not have to obey the feudal law. The reason why this matters in the concept that we're talking about right now is because the first territorial states were born in the cross-hatched areas. And for a very good reason. If you're a territorial state, you grew by putting together pre-existing regions with their little towns, pre-existing provinces, but it was much easier for you to crystallize, to coagulate, to become an entity in areas where there were not strong cities to oppose you. So the cross-hatched areas, although they had cities, and the cities had grown during the upswing, Paris, for instance, grows during the upswing, and London grows during the upswing, and so they are in fact cities. The majority of land is agricultural land owned by a feudal lord and with closed economies, and was exactly the type of open spaces that a military person from the capital could easily conquer and could easily put together into a larger territory. In the polka dot zones, there was too many little city-states, each one very jealous of its independence, each one very jealous of its autonomy. They had gained their autonomy from the feudal lord, so they were going to resist being joined together into a single entity for as long as they could. So historically, the last city-states come precisely in the areas dominated by the polka dots. Italy did not come together as a nation-state until the 19th century. Germany, at least northern Germany, did not come together as a nation until the 19th century. It was broken down into, it came together first in chunks, Prussia, certain other parts of Germany and so on, but Germany as we know it is a 19th century phenomenon. And Belgium and Holland also retarded their political, they're becoming a larger entity for the longest time. Amsterdam retaining its ability to deal with everybody for as long, almost as long as the 30 Years' War. During the 30 Years' War, Amsterdam sells weapons to both sides. And when you start selling weapons to both sides, you don't belong to either side. You're outside the war, profiting from the war. It is the surviving city-states, or rather cities, because there were no city-states anymore, the surviving cities belonging to the network, a network now encompassing New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and eventually LA on the West Coast, cities in the coast of India, Indochina, and even China and Japan, that eventually become the backbone of globalization. Globalization as we see today is still based on cities that were many of which were from that period, like Rotterdam, or there were cities that were new, like New York, but there were cities that had been incorporated to that network that by belonging to the network managed to resist total absorption into the network, into the nascent territorial states. At any rate, the way in which these guys put themselves together, put different territories together to create a larger kingdom, a larger empire, was militarily. And the way in which the city-states were brought to their knees in both of these days was militarily. So what we need to study today is military history. Let me say something very fast about how this happened, because we're going to return to that. It is not as the city-states had lost on a single battle against a better army. The fact of the matter is that they had better armies. They had started the commercialization of violence in the 13th century. So they had invented the job of the condottieri, that is the manager of armies, someone who you can hire to put together an army on 6 months or so, and then keep the army together and make the payments and so on. So the city-states in Italy were in fact more powerful militarily than anybody else. The reason why they eventually lost is not so much because they lost on a single battle or a series of battles, but because they could not keep up with the finances of arms races. Now remember what an arms race is. An arms race is a spiral of mutually stimulating advances in technology. The offense invents a new weapon to destroy walls or to penetrate a castle or to kill enemy combatants. Well, the defense then has to invent a new defensive weapon. New walls, new fortifications, new armor to prevent you from penetrating their bodies with your projectiles. But that, in turn, puts a pressure on the offense to invent something better that can penetrate the new walls, that can scale or climb over the new walls, or that can penetrate that armor, which in turn puts pressure on the defense to invent something new. An arms race is not just a single episode of an improvement and a response to the improvement, but a continuous explosive growth or spiraling growth of offensive and defensive technologies challenging each other and becoming better with time. Now, arms races cost money. And arms races are very, very hard to stop once they get started. In China, in Islam, like the Ottoman Empire, in India, There were a few, the beginnings of an arms race, but they were put down immediately by the government. Because governments know that arms races make things go out of control. The self-stimulating dynamics of an arms race in cybernetics is called a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is what you have in your thermostat, which means that there's a sensor that's sensing the temperature, and something called an actuator that can change the temperature. So you set the temperature at, say, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The sensor senses that you have now gone a little too below or a little too above 70 degrees, tells the actuator to turn either the heat or the cold until it reaches 70 degrees again, and the sensor stops, the actuator stops. In other words, negative feedback, the feedback between a sensor and an actuator, keeps temperature under control. So negative feedback is for control. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is for out of control. The typical example of positive feedback is an explosion in, say, gunpowder. The speed at which gunpowder burns, the rate of burning of gunpowder, depends on how much heat there is around it. So at the beginning of an explosion, when you first light up gunpowder, it starts very slow. But because gunpowder produces heat as it burns, it begins heating its surroundings, and so the surroundings feed back into the gunpowder, accelerating it. The more it's accelerated, the more heat it produces, the more it's accelerated, and now you get positive feedback. You get self-stimulation between the heat that's being produced by the explosion and the effect of the heat on the explosion by accelerating even faster, and it is that positive feedback that eventually leads to an explosion. So whereas negative feedback is to keep temperature under control, in a thermostat, for instance, positive feedback allows temperature to go out of control and produce an explosion. An arms race is positive feedback. And that is why governments in China, in the Ottoman Empire, and other places put them down immediately. Because governments are in the business of negative feedback, of keeping things, for instance, inflation or a bunch of other variables, under control. They don't want any kind of spiral that goes out of control. But because Europe remained fragmented into different warring states, or warring city-states, or warring nation-states, until the 20th century and beyond, there was no one to actually try to stop these arms races. The very first arms race occurred around 1300, with the invention of the crossbow, or the perfection of the crossbow. The crossbow is just like a bow, only it's mechanical. You can wind it instead of just pulling on the string and injecting muscular energy that gets stored in that string, that gets passed to the arrow. Here you do the same thing. You store muscular energy, only you store it on a string or some other kind of a storage device, so that when you shoot the crossbow, it comes at a much faster speed than if you had actually pulled the string by hand. The Pope thought that the crossbow was a weapon from the devil or something like that, and he passed an act forbidding crossbows. Now, do you really believe that anyone actually obeyed that law? No. They probably obeyed it for like a year or so, and they would continue to construct crossbows, maybe crossing themselves as they did that, just in case. They tried to stop those arms races, but unlike China and Islamic countries, they could not stop the arms races. So in Europe, there's arms races going on non-stop from the 13th to the 20th century and beyond, because we're still in the middle of arms races. Biological arms races, nuclear arms races, soon it's going to be nanotechnology arms races, cyber attack arms races, who can do better hackings, who can build better firewalls. Arms races haven't stopped. And it's one of those sources of self-stimulation that has kept history interesting. In other words, has kept history from settling into an equilibrium. Has kept history, mostly European history, but then Europe exported all these things to everywhere else, on the edge. So it was the finances of arms races that eventually ruined the city-states. The city-states could have won militarily, problem was, in other words, they could have won this one battle and they could have won the next battle. What they were bound to lose in the end, not by any kind of natural necessity, but by this, by the fact that they could not keep up with the self-stimulating dynamics, is in the long run. They simply did not have the money. Arms races started becoming more and more expensive once artillery was invented, once artillery became, made of bronze and other very fancy metals. So the people with the largest territories had not only access to a much larger pool of recruits, and therefore potentially larger armies, but also a larger base of taxpayers, which meant lots more money for the treasury, lots more money to keep those arsenals and armories current with the latest weaponry. So cities, in fact, did not lose a war. They lost the finances of war. They lost the ability to keep fighting wars over the long run with more and more sophisticated weapons. Now, I'm going to have to make a little parenthesis from our historical narrative. I will get back to it in a second. Because the concepts that we need to study what comes next, that is the history of armies in the West, starting in 1494, we want to know in detail is exactly how cities lost. We want to zoom in now to the size of organizations, that is to the size of armies, to be able to get our story at different scales at the same time. But in order to zoom into the size of armies, we need to backtrack several hundred years, in fact, more than a millennium, but very fast, to find out who really invented warfare, who invented armies, and what is the source of the different types of armies that we saw that were present in the period that we're talking about. Now I'm going to contrast two entirely different armies. On one hand, nomad armies. That is, the armies created by the peoples from the central steppes of Asia. Those are Huns, as in Attila the Hun, Mongols, as in Genghis Khan, the Hittites. I can't right now have a good name for a Hittite commander, but there's very famous names. And there's 20, 30 or so ethnic groups that all are classified together as nomads from the steppes. And I'm going to contrast them with our armies, that is, the armies that we have as urban peoples. We are, as urban people, sedentary peoples. Right? We took root. So I'm making a comparison now between two very different types of armies. Sedentary armies belonging to any region of the world that build cities out of stone or out of brick. That is, permanent cities. The nomad armies were very different and had a very different lifestyle, as we will see in a second. Let me first introduce this distinction before I write the differences. And let's go back even farther in time. Let's go back 10,000 years in time to the discovery of agriculture. Prior to that, of course, human beings had spent several 100,000 years as hunter-gatherers. And as hunter-gatherers, they were pretty resilient. Hunter-gatherers developed a very wide knowledge of nuts and berries, of different barks of trees that are edible, of different types of animals that are edible, different types of grasses that are edible. And so when weather changes, when climatic patterns change, they can change from one type of foodstuff to another type of foodstuff. They move around so that they can find different types of foodstuff as they move around. They're actually pretty resilient bunches. And that's how we all started as hunter-gatherers 70,000, 80,000 years ago. Eventually, though, a few hunter-gatherers in the areas that today are Mesopotamia, today is Iraq and Egypt, there is Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, they discovered that certain grasses, the grasses that with selective breeding would eventually become wheat and corn and barley and a variety of other cereals, could in fact be cultivated and cultivated in place. So they became sedentary for the first time. For the first time, agricultural villages began to pop up in Egypt and Mesopotamia. That period is called the Neolithic. And at that point, you don't know, since these people have been mobile for millennia, you don't know if human beings domesticated plants or domesticated humans, in the sense that the moment we began to cultivate plants, we ourselves took root. The moment you start cultivating plants, and you have a good piece of land that is irrigated by the Nile, or is irrigated by rain, and it's flat enough so you're not going to lose the topsoil and so on, you stay there. You stay there with your plants. So you begin taking over the genetic mechanism of plants to redirect biomass to the edible parts. But plants are now forcing you to stay, to take root, to become sedentary. Of course, we take sedentary life for granted today, but sedentary life was not anything to be taken for granted 10,000 years ago. It was rare. It was a rarity. And it was not as if it had been an obvious step for those hunter-gatherers, as if they had all of a sudden, say, hit on the idea of agriculture and go, hey, why didn't we think about this before? This is better than what we were doing. Yes, agriculture in the long run can in fact produce surpluses and feed more people, but at the beginning it was in fact more dangerous, more brittle. A bad harvest kills you. And you begin losing all that knowledge about nuts and berries and so on that the hunter-gatherers had. Also, problem with refuse, with what to do with your feces, what to do with garbage and things that you dispose, becomes a problem once you are sedentary. When you are a hunter-gatherer, come on in, don't worry. So there's now new diseases that come with being sedentary. Nevertheless, in the long run it pays because you can actually begin producing surpluses, and once you produce surplus, that is, once you begin, the harvest begins yielding more than you can eat and more than enough for seed for the next season, those surpluses begin to accumulate. And once those surpluses begin to accumulate, cities begin to emerge. Any city in the world, as we saw already, is parasitic on its countryside, but any city in the world depends on the existence of surpluses. Because without surpluses, you cannot have division of labor. You cannot have a bunch of farmers that, farmers in the old times were part-time metallurgists, part-time farmers, part-time carpenters. They had to do everything themselves. They had to fix their own tools. They had to sharpen their own tools. They had to create their own furniture. But of course, if you can have division of labor, so that people can specialize in being carpenters, can specialize in being blacksmiths, and so on, you can have a much faster development of that craft. And that is only possible if you now have, if you're a city-state that has grain stored, because you can pay. In other words, people don't have to produce their own food anymore. You can feed them from the storage houses, and then they can dedicate all day to being blacksmiths, to being carpenters, to being soldiers. So the division of labor and the creation of armies, at least at the level of city-states, depended on the existence of a surplus. So sedentary armies come from that tradition. The tradition of people settling down and creating what we might call a mineralized exoskeleton around you. The walls of the city, the buildings that house you, the buildings that house organizations are a kind of skeleton, similar to the one that, shellfish or even insects build organically on the outside of their bodies. Insects and mollusks wear their bones on the outside. We happen to wear our bones on the inside. It's a little more aesthetic. But this mineral exoskeleton under which we are right now is part, in a way, of the exoskeleton, if not of persons, of communities and organizations. And so that is one thing that cities began doing, mineralizing themselves and solidifying their sedentary status. The peoples that inhabited the central steppes of Africa, of Asia, the Huns, the Mongols, the Hittites, and many others, did not take root. They were not hunter-gatherers because they domesticated organic creatures, but they didn't happen to domesticate plants. They domesticated horses. And horses are by nature migratory species. So unlike sedentary people who were forced to stay in place by their plants, the nomads from the central steppes of Asia were forced to move by their horses. And they adopted a migratory lifestyle, which is why they're called the nomads from the central steppes. They follow their horses across the grasslands of the central steppes of Africa, of Asia, which are it's a particularly rough environment. You need to be tough. There's a cold wind blowing all year round that makes it kind of inhospitable. And the soils are not particularly good for planting anything. And there's plenty of horses, plenty of horse herds that you can follow, and that you can use, of course, as war machines, as we saw the other day. A horse is by its own presence a war machine, because it transforms anything that you can have in your hand. As long as you mount it, and you mount it right, so that you are part of the horse, you can hit anything with a broomstick in your hand, and you will hit it with the power of the mass multiplied by the velocity of the horse. That is, with the full momentum of the horse. Nomads also had to settle down at certain parts of the year when their horses settled down in a particular piece of grassland, but they, of course, did not mineralize themselves. They did not build a mineral infrastructure around them to build a permanent settlement. They built tent-like buildings. And so nomad architecture might be of interest to you guys, particularly now that tent-like roofs for stadiums and tent-like roofs for a variety of other applications have become common thanks to the availability of new materials, so pre-stressed materials with air inside and so on. We have now a bunch of new materials and techniques to create tent-like structures. Tent-like structures like an open umbrella used as design elements of curvature. You know, a flat umbrella is not very much of an umbrella. It needs to have a certain curvature to maintain its integrity. And of course, tension. A loose umbrella is not much of an umbrella, which was during a storm. But a taut umbrella is a good umbrella. So you need to be taut and curved. So those are two design elements, which are normally not present in, with rigid materials. And so therefore lead to a different assignment and design possibilities and so on. Well, studying the housing of the nomads might be a good place to start, because they had to live in foldable cities. They were moving from place to place following their horses, so they needed to be able to unfold their houses and create, they were very numerous, so they were several thousands in a large community divided into sub-communities. So there was plenty. There were a city, but a city made out of tents, a foldable city, a city that could be transported around as they moved around. I find that idea very interesting. The idea that humanity liquefied or solidified or condensed out of that hunter-gatherer past in two different ways. Us, the people who surrounded themselves with mud, bricks, and stone walls, and build a permanent place, and this is my apartment, this is my house, and it will be my house forever. And the nomads who created a completely different lifestyle that is almost unknown to us, because of course sedentary peoples invented writing. The nomads didn't have writing, so sedentary peoples left books behind that we can read, or inscriptions in stone or in papyrus and so on that we can read and therefore know about their history, whereas the nomad army's history needs to be reconstructed from tales by visitors and the few scraps of writing that some of them managed to leave behind. They're a mystery to us because they are another type of humanity and because they hated our guts. The nomads' armies used to invade cities and raze cities. They just hated it so much. They were wolves, we were Chihuahua dogs. That was their vision. We were a moderated kind of people with weird little manners and lipstick and so on that had become tamed and literally bred into Chihuahua dogs within cities, whereas they were the real humanity, the real warriors, the real tough, the original tough people on earth. And in point of fact, they beat the crap out of sedentary armies in just about every encounter until the advent of arms races. They lost against sedentary armies around the 15th century for the same reason that city-states lost against territorial states. They did not have attack states. They did not have, they had a large pool of recruits, but they simply could not keep up with expenses. They knew how to use the fire weapons. The Turkish army, which has strong nomadic roots, incorporated them into their ranks, but they just couldn't keep up with expense. Nevertheless, it will be interesting to see the differences, because as we will see, the history of contemporary armies is the history of their small nomadization. The nomad armies were based on mounted archers. So they were basically a cavalry-based, cavalry missile throwing army in which everything was about movement. They never stayed put. They were constantly moving, and they were trained every single day in an exercise called the hunt, similar to what the British do when they hunt a fox with dogs and so on. There would be a fox or some other animal released, and they would all follow them. But this was done every day. It was not a sport. It was part of their lifestyle. That's how they initiated little boys, 13-year-olds and so on, into the armies, by making them part of the exercise. And by doing that day after day after day, they develop a way of either coming together as teams of mounted archers, or fighting on their own. And then finding themselves together, they would come together as a large army, and then they could divide into smaller ones to surround the enemy and surprise them. In other words, they could exercise plenty of initiative in battlefield. And that's the important thing. Just write the whole thing. Could exercise initiative. Cannot spell and talk and chew gum at the same time. They could make decisions on the fly. They did not have to follow the original command attack, and then everything was impossible to control. Here they could change the plan in the middle. This meant two things in terms of space. Take advantage of topographical accidents. A little mound, a little accidents for ambush and surprise. And in terms of time, take advantage not long-lasting tactical opportunities. Let me explain this. Imagine you're facing a large army, a large standing army, a large infantry army in front of you with long pikes and their armor and so on, and you have to attack them with your cavalry and your arrows. Well, at first you would do several sorties, sending horses in different directions and perhaps submitting them to crossfire, but then, the guys that are holding on with their shields and so on. But suddenly, some inexperienced soldiers, perhaps new recruits towards the middle, panic and run away. And a few of the others, relatively inexperienced ones on the sides, see the ones running away and also run away. And all of a sudden, a hole opens in the middle of that wall of infantry. Now, that hole is going to last for about 5 minutes, because the commander of that army will see the hole, will immediately send, a detachment. Hey, go, you guys, go in there and plug that hole in the middle. So it's going to last 5 minutes. So it's a fleeting tactical opportunity. It's an opportunity to do something tactical, but that's not going to last very long, right? And if you cannot have initiative in the battlefield, if you're just following orders, and the orders do not include go right through the hole, then that hole will close itself up and you will miss the opportunity. But if you can exercise initiative in the battlefield, you see that hole, you tell the few mounted archers behind you, hey, rally behind me, or come right behind me, I'm going to go right through that hole. And then you now can lead 20, 30 or so of your soldiers through the hole, fan out behind the enemy lines, and do what is called outflanking them. You surround them, and you start firing from both sides. There's nothing that can cause a drop in morale more rapidly than that type of outflanking movement, when they have penetrated you and now they're shooting to you from both sides. Had they not been able to exercise initiative in the battlefield, they would not have been able to do that. And if they had not been trained day to day on this cooperative team way of forming teams, and then then forming larger groups, and then forming smaller teams, and even being able to fight on your own, they would have ever been able to do that. And similarly for ambush and surprise, they were excellent at taking advantage. First of all, they were excellent at pre-scouting the battlefield where the battle was going to take place the following day. So you see that mound over there? We can hide behind it. We can attract the army, lure the army into that and then attack it this way. Or see this other place there? We can use that for surprise. So ambush, surprise are the kinds of things that you need flexibility to do. Sedentary armies, on the other hand, they also had a cavalry, but the cavalry typically was a very small portion of the army, and it was reserved for aristocratic people, the only ones who could afford horses. The main armies were an infantry phalanx. This is a great invention of urban people when it comes to warfare. A phalanx is a square 8 men deep and up to several miles long, depending on the place. Now here's the most important aspect of a phalanx. Phalanx was a square of tightly packed infantry people. Each one of those circles represents a soldier. They were equipped with lances, pikes, swords. Now the ones that I'm cross-hatching here, the ones inside the phalanx, and because you're the inexperienced soldiers. So what a phalanx was good at doing, I just threw a couple of very tiny little soldiers, almost like little dwarfs. Let me just fix that. Is that you could put the seasoned soldiers, very, very dark-skinned, very thick-skinned mercenaries outside, and then sandwich in between the inexperienced soldiers. What that meant is that the guys on the outside will be policing and surveying the newbies, so that they would not be able to escape, they would not be able to desert, they would not be able to go around. They are sandwiched by the tough ones, right? And as long as the square, as long as the phalanx kept its coherence, say under a cavalry attack, and they would have long pikes sticking out from the front row and all the other rows too. So a cavalry attack, say by the nomads against the phalanx, would fail if the phalanx keeps its nerve. Everybody in the phalanx keeps its nerve. Horses won't impale themselves on sharp pikes. Horses are not stupid. The horse will run as fast as it can, but at the very last minute, if that guy doesn't move, the horse will stop, sending his mounted archer over, to its death. So the hope of a cavalry attack was, of course, that you would provoke these guys to open up. You would make them break, lose their nerve. As long as you could do that, a phalanx was easy to be broken. Or, of course, if you could surround it and begin shooting it from different places. So a phalanx was good in space, to hold terrain, and for hand-to-hand combat when it came to that. That is phalanx versus phalanx. So they were capable of holding terrain against a cavalry attack and then engage in hand-to-hand combat with other phalanxes. In time, however, they were extremely rigid. In fact, impossible to control, once the order to attack has been given. The order to attack, if you had 20, 30, 50 of these phalanxes right next to each other, the order to attack was given either by a sound, a trumpet or something like that, or by a visual standard, a flag or some other form of icon that you raised, and that means advance, attack. But once those phalanxes began to march and move towards the enemy, you could not stop raising other standards. Move to the left, move to the right. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say attack, or stuff like, going with the trumpets, trying to kind of change the rhythm of the phalanx. Phalanx were impossible to control. They could not exercise initiative in the battlefield. If you were part of a phalanx, you could not all of a sudden decide, hey, let's break half of the phalanx and make it go this way, and half of the phalanx will go that way. Or, look, there's a hole in the middle of the enemy army. Let's take advantage of that. You could not take advantage of that. In all the encounters between nomad armies and phalanxes, whether the phalanxes were Chinese, whether they were Roman, whether they were Greek, whether they were any kind of army, the nomads always won. The nomads up to the 15th century were considered the masters of the battlefield and were feared because of that, particularly because they were extremely cruel. We admire them today for a variety of things, including their tent-like architecture. We admire them for being a kind of different type of humanity that we are, we urban people, so that they can give us a sense of otherness. But they were very, very cruel people and killed without any sense of compassion. Nevertheless, and for that reason, they always won. The reason to mention this, guys, and I'm going to erase what I have on the board so to move on, yeah? is because the history of armies in the West, starting with the 30 Years' War, is the history of their slow normalization. Little by little, phalanxes became flatter and flatter. By the time of the American Civil War, phalanxes were one line deep. By the 1500s, they were 3 deep. By Napoleonic Wars, the Civil War was 1 line deep. But they continued to fight in tight formations. And we will see in a second what were the factors that began to convert sedentary armies into full nomad armies as Western armies are today. Today, Western armies don't fight in tight formations. They don't use phalanxes. They fight like the nomads. But it took a long time for that to happen. So let's go back to what we had here before. Remember, 1494. First invasion of city-states by territorial states. The beginning of the end of city-states. What happened in 1494? Well, prior to 1494, roughly 1454, I can't remember the exact date, the artillery based on gunpowder had made its appearance in the West. Artillery was invented by the Chinese, as we already saw earlier on in class, and they had a powerful artillery prior to this. But in the West, the first powerful display of artillery was by the Turks when they invaded Constantinople, when they besieged Constantinople and converted Constantinople into Istanbul as it is today. The siege of Constantinople lasted more than a year. It was a long siege. And back then, when you besieged a city, you had plenty of time to set up workshops. You had to set up kitchens, for one thing, because you need to feed. You know, if it was a 5,000 strong army, well, you need to feed 5,000 people every day. So an army that stops for a siege becomes another city, a city outside the city, almost like a suburb of military people out at sea. And of course, besieging a city is an important historical event. Cities changed when they're under siege. Their time rhythms changes. Now there are curfews. And now you can go out on the street from, say, 10 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, but then it's forbidden to be out on the streets. That changes your rhythms of life. Certain areas of the city become now prohibitive to civilians. There are limited access to certain areas, so that changes your day-to-day routines. Time and space changes in a besieged city, not to mention psychology. The psychology of being under siege, when you know you're surrounded by armies, they're denying you any kind of reinforcements, they're denying you water and food. If there are diseases running in the city now, you cannot have medicine from the outside. It is a very interesting, historically, state for a city, the state of siege. Well, that state was endured by Constantinople, surrounded by the Turks. Eventually the Turks win and transform it into Istanbul, as I just said. But the important thing for the current purposes is that the cannon that the Turks used in the siege of Constantinople was actually forged in sight. The Turks had created metallurgical workshops, blacksmiths' workshops, staffed them with blacksmiths, and they had plenty of time, this was going to last a year, going to last 2 years, to actually have excess time, if anything. And they actually, created cannon right on the spot. Cannon using chemical energy, gunpowder, burning gunpowder to propel its projectiles, was in fact at the time inferior to other missile-throwing engines like the catapult or the trebuchet, which had existed since ancient times. A trebuchet or a catapult was a mechanical, not a chemical engine in which you store, you had a wheel that several men had to turn to store muscular energy into some kind of spring. The spring could be made out of metal, or in many cases it was made of tendon, the tendon of cows, the tendon of dead horses. Tendon is the part of your body that interfaces muscle and bone, and in addition to being able, muscle is too floppy to be controlled directly by bone. You need some kind of intermediate material. Tendon, if you see it in that exhibit, the body, I don't know if you guys ever saw that exhibit with actual corpses plastinated. It's fantastic because you're not seeing sculptures. You're actually seeing corpses in which a machine replaced all the water from every cell with epoxy simultaneously. So you keep every hair, every cell, and so as far as showing you the anatomy of things, it's just amazing. And when you see tendons, for instance, they are the muscles that move my fingers right now are actually in the back of my in my back, not near the fingers. And there's tendons, long lines of tendons, like almost like a puppeteer, are moving my fingers right now from commands given up here. You see that in that exhibition so clearly. It's unbelievable. I mean, how we are constructed at a structural engineering level. So tendon used to be kept, the tendon from cows, the tendon from dead horses, the tendon from wild animals, and used as part of the springs for catapults. So then you put a rock or something on the catapult and you throw it over the walls to land, perhaps on fire or something like that, to land inside the city. The cannon used by the Turks during the siege of Constantinople was not as powerful in terms of missile throwing power as a catapult, but it had advantages. Most importantly, the sound it made, the sound of explosion. Most people had never heard those sounds before, and it was scary. It was psychologically scary, even as its missiles bounced off the walls for not having enough power. Nevertheless, between the siege of Constantinople, which happens in the middle of the 15th century, and our date, 1494, many improvements were made to artillery. Artillery right now was created not on the spot, but in special arsenals and armories where quality control could be had in a much more efficient way. And they had invented the gun carriage, so you could transport them to the place of the siege. Finally, the profession of the artillerist as a specialization of infantry had already developed, so that there was a special corps of infantry that was in charge of artillery and knew everything about cannonballs, gunpowder, the amount of pressure that you need to put on with the cannonball and the gunpowder to make it go out, whether to check for fractures in the artillery because they were going to blow up in your face.